Hello friends, Anderson here. This is Kill 10 Rats RPG Ironsworn supplemental. It's another one of these. And if you've been following the series so far, you might rightly be wondering how did we get here, because I haven't actually published the part that got me to this point yet, as it happened right at the start of the recording session that I had after publishing the most recent episode. And what happened at the start of that recording session was another delve move, as you do, since we had caught a brief moment of rest and relaxation and Kynan had to move on. And as a result of that delve move, I encountered a helpful denizen, and I rolled a 90 something, and that helpful denizen turned out to be a glimmer. And that's where it all kind of went from action-packed delve to unstructured ramblings, which after about 15 to 20 minutes I just gave up on, because first of all it was kind of hard to follow, and second, this is kind of not the point of the main series. That's what these videos are for, to expand upon our lore of our version of the Ironlands. So what actually was the problem, and why is having a glimmer show up suddenly a challenge? Which brings me to the point where we should probably have a look at what a glimmer is, and maybe you can understand why this threw me. The glimmer are beings of mysterious origin and intent. They are most often encountered as particles of light which coalesce into a luminous humanoid or animal form, and the illustration here makes it look like a bunch of glowworms coalescing into a humanoid shape. And then the rest of the text goes on to describe them as being drawn to those in need and occasionally offering assistance, but also being somewhat mischievous and occasionally leading them astray, or at least leading them down paths that the Ironlanders who are being quote-unquote helped don't understand. And the problem that I had with all of this was that by association, it immediately reminded me of stars and lights and the firmament, which then made me wonder what exactly is a glimmer and how does it fit in with our Ironlands so far. And that's where I mainly become a bit of a victim of my own approach. And that's an approach that I hadn't really formally given a name to, but I've recently started watching the Bad Spot since I started getting into Starforged. And Matt Rispy, the host there, calls it joining the dots, I think, and that's exactly what my approach is as well. I would like to have the set pieces that show up in our version of the Ironlands to make sense. And to form some kind of cohesive lore, I really try to form as many connections between disjointed oracle results as I can. And if I am delving a place where there is like a star chamber, at least somewhere deep down there that we know of, and then this luminescent being of mysterious origin shows up, I'm starting to wonder, how the hell does it fit in? And that's basically what this video is about, because then we touch upon things like Kalidas's supposed true rulers of the Ironlands and the precursor civilizations and how that all relates to each other, because the star chambers are part of all of that topic. So I really needed to run through all of these elements and make sense of them and kind of join the dots, but also draw the lines away from some of the elements so we have a clear distinction between our themes, because I do have sort of some emerging themes here in our antagonist portfolio that I get a sense of, and that is something I'd also like to drill down a little bit today, so we have an easier time separating it, because as we will see, like the game is really trying to muddle those, and I don't like it. I would like to have not everything being down to the same root cause. I would like to have established lines where this is one theme and its antagonist and its storylines, and this is another. And if we have a look here, this is basically all we know about these precursors that left us the Star Chambers. The world building section tells us, before the Ironlanders, before even the Firstborn and other people lived here, their ancient ruins are found throughout the Ironlands. Now, that's Kalidas's true rulers, we decided. And they disappeared somehow, and now they want to come back. Did they coexist with the Firstborn? They were there before, but did the Firstborn still get to meet them? That would give us a potential level of insight by those like never dead before elves, like Arsula is, if they had potentially been in their presence, but I think if they have been in their presence, it's mostly as sort of terrified, cowering in the dark, newborn peoples, whereas these ancient precursors were probably quite terrifying to be around in their way of doing things. So if there was a coexistence, I don't think there was much of an alliance. I think the precursors would, if anything, see the firstborn as a kind of flesh and blood material or potential servitors, but nothing more. Which brings me to the themes that I would like to drill out before we continue, and that I kind of abstractified in my head. And one of those is this pure nightmare horror theme that is also embodied by the horrors that we ran into in the first story arc. And the other is more of a cosmic horror theme that is more related to the Star Chambers and the precursors. And I would like to keep those separated like 99% with some overlap in between them, but it sort of remains to be seen and decided whether that overlap is actually there or whether that's just individual connections and maybe also the Ironlanders just reading something into this where they assume a relation between horrors and cosmic horror precursor things that just isn't there, and where they misread the whole thing. That for me is kind of one of the things I'd like to figure out today. I did prepare some notes, some set piece elements and some questions that I want to ask myself, and I do wonder to what extent the dice come into play today, because I think the fiction gives us quite a lot to work with already, and rolling dice in the current situation might actually make it worse. Let's maybe first elaborate on the nightmare theme currently embodied in Arsula. I've already mentioned it in the world building episode for Worlds Without Number. I like to work with themes. That's something that Vampire the Masquerade taught me as sort of a guiding principle for my stories, to keep them together, keep them cohesive. So I'd like to drill down what theme am I currently exploring, and then also enables me, like knowing about this enables me to throw in set pieces and story elements that fit with the theme. So nightmare, that is Arsula, and that is also to some extent the horror. That is for me an expression of the unformed, of the, let's say, entropy of the primordial essence of the universe that did not have a purpose. I think we established that is where the horrors come from, sort of when reality separated, some essence was left behind and it had no purpose and it was unformed, and it started to be affected by physical laws and entropy, and it started to get touched by the minds of the sentient creatures around it, and then it tried to find its purpose there. And that's how horrors, these mutated primordial essences, started existing. And I think on the other side of the reality, that's where this nightmare realm that Arsula tries to tap exists. It's basically almost functioning like an enormous horror that's its own plane and maybe even its own consciousness, and that touches the minds of people through their worst fears. And this interaction charges it and gives it some leeway into the physical realm. And I think this is also where this nightmare realm parallels of horror, because it strives to be physical. It wants to re-engage with how things were before the reality separated. And so the nightmare strives to go back into the, for the sentient creatures, real world, which is where Arsula comes in and wants to try and facilitate this as the sort of ultimate red button nuke to blow everything up, because he thinks him and his demigod-like never-dead elves, they will be able to persist and survive and arrange themselves with this and then rebuild. By the way, if you're hearing some rumblings in the background, that's because nature has provided a scenic thunderstorm as a backdrop to this recording. So that's basically the nightmare theme that we're exploring in our current story arc. And that is so it's separate from the campaign vow theme of going after Kaladas, and now also having this tormented condition where we swore to prevent the return of Kaladas's true rulers, which is this cosmic horror theme. And that's where I think the Glimmer comes into play a bit later. And that gives us also some indicators lined up already. So the true rulers are the precursors that Kaladas wants to bring back, which means they went away at some point. Was that intentional or a side effect of something? I presume the latter. I think that was an unintended consequence. But it also raises the question, who were they and where did they go? And what about these ruins that we see? Because they're not really ubiquitous. They're in parts of the Ironlands. You do find these precursor ruins. But one clue on taking stock here and drilling out the elements of the fiction we had to go with this cosmic horror theme, I found was that so far the two main touch points we have with them, these star chambers, both of them are underground. Which makes me wonder, is the ruin remnant that we see of this precursor civilization that exists on the surface of the Ironlands only a tip of the iceberg kind of thing, where these are outposts and maybe even destinations for research and resource gathering and potentially enslavement? But do we maybe place the main civilization of the precursors in an underground area of the Ironlands that isn't accessible at all unless you have a way to operate these star chambers and you know how to get to that destination? That would make it quite convenient as a means to explain why the Ironlanders haven't found it yet. Even if they're going caving and delving and all of that, they just have no way to get there unless they end up digging and accidentally stumbling into it. But we don't know, maybe that has happened somewhere and nobody managed to make sense of it. But I do kind of like the suggestion and this conclusion we can draw from where we found the star chamber, first one, and where we know the second one is located, that is underground stuff. So our precursor civilization was predominantly based underground. That's where they had cities, that's where they had things that Ironlanders haven't ever heard of, ways that just don't exist anymore, that maybe the old worlders still had. Now the question is, are they still there or did they go somewhere? And the answer to that seems to be that if Kaladas wants to bring them back, and we know the star chambers still work, because Asha used them, it's likely that they went away in some way. And if we draw a parallel to something like the Dwemer in the Elder Scrolls universe, I think that's the most likely parallel suggestion that comes to mind right now. I would assume that they did something to elevate themselves. Like we already established that they probably wanted to make themselves as gods, or they wanted to make themselves into the stars somehow. They wanted to become the cosmos, the cosm or cos. Maybe that went wrong somehow. Maybe they took it too far and they got an access denied message once they wanted to get back to the domination of the physical world that they still wanted to subjugate. They were power hungry, we assume. They have that lust that everything immaterial has to be material or to affect and influence the material. That's, I think, another theme of our setting, that the immaterial always wants to try to affect or dominate the material. That's a bit of a Warhammer 40k thing, I guess. So overall, we assume that there was some kind of incident in the distant past where, bam, the apotheosis, the star becoming happened, but it locked them out from our version of reality. And they've been struggling to come back ever since. And now to tie us back into the reason we have this episode is, how does that explain what a glimmer is? And to my mind, thinking about it some more and bringing some structure into this, or attempting to at least, I get the sense that maybe that wasn't a fully unanimous thing in that precursor civilization. Maybe there were dissenters who didn't go along with the plan, or who found some flaw in it, who tried to protect themselves against it and, well, became something else. And they stuck around. They do have the ability to manifest still in the physical world, unlike their, well, let's call them evil counterparts. And that's what a glimmer is. It's a subfaction of the precursors, an ancient consciousness that has its own plans and designs, and it goes against the plans and designs of what Kaladas wants, which is to bring the evil ones back. And since it's a helpful entity, according to our lore here, that might answer the question why it's showing up when it does near a star chamber, where I assume the walls between realities are thinnest, and offer some assistance to Kynan. We assume. We don't know. We haven't played that part yet. I just want to kind of get to the point where I understand what this Glimmer wants to do and why it does what it does or will do. So if we assume two factions, then we have the ones that reach this apotheosis star becoming status, and we have the other ones that find this is hubris and that think only bad things can come from this, and they want to find a different mode of living with the later born peoples, whereas it's possible that the ones that reach this higher level of not very physical existence anymore, they want to come back as gods, and they want to assume their true rulership of the Ironlands and just subjugate everything and everyone, which is what the other ones, the Glimmer ones, don't want. Now there's two problems I have with this, and two problems I think I can resolve. One is that Kynan meets this Glimmer in the nightmare existence that he's currently trapped in. So that would put it closer to that theme of the nightmarish horror, which we want to distinguish from this whole precursor cosmic horror thing. But my inkling there is that Kynan meets this Glimmer near what effectively is like an interplanar teleportation device, this star chamber. So we can assume probably that whatever happens in and around a star chamber is something that a Glimmer will have some influence on or insight into, no matter what plane of existence it happens on. So they are able to shift into various planes, but it gets harder and harder the farther they are from their nexus points where the reality overlaps are the thinnest. So that's, I think, something we can kind of hand wave away if we want to, like I do, want to keep those themes separate. The other thing is the vocabulary choice, which is gloom and glimmer. That's probably an intended juxtaposition in the design here, that the glimmer and the gloom are kind of two sides of the same coin, and the gloom we already associated with the nightmare realm. So how does that fit together? And that's, I think, where our Ironlanders come in, because that's probably not what they call themselves. So how I see this is that probably the Ironlanders, seeing these glimmers show up in the same places as the glooms occasionally show up, assume they're related and connected and give them juxtaposed names, since one is dark and one is bright. But what they fail to realize is that the only reason they show up in the same spots is that they both require this thinning of the walls of reality to function. The gloom to sneak out of the nightmare realm and lash out and try to manifest something nightmarish in reality, and the glimmer in turn as a traveler from beyond the planes that doesn't have a physical existence anymore and needs this proximity to their planar traveling device to even be able to function and interact with people. So as much as it's a bit like crowbarring the themes apart, I really am somewhat invested in doing that, since I don't want to have everything connected to everything. There's something in me that just rebels against connecting Arsula and Kaladesh and somehow making the one affect the other and making everything be of one thing. I think there are different stages and levels of antagonism here, and it all kind of bleeds into that main over theme of the immaterial trying to take over the material. But it's two different expressions of that aren't really related. They just follow similar rules. That's probably also why the Ironlanders start throwing terms around like the Marsh of Souls when it comes to what we assume is like a precursor ruin, because they misunderstand what's going on. Like they see all of these strange manifestations and associate it with some kind of afterlife, while in reality it's more like the expression of something much more terrifying, but they're simply misreading it and giving it names that they think work for what they're seeing, and they just misunderstand. So that leaves our Glimmer in a spot where it probably becomes aware of Kynan as he approaches what we assume is the Star Chamber somewhere underneath of Arsula's prison. And since Kynan has the tormented condition, and he has that vow to prevent the return of the true rulers, and that vow to stop Kaladesh, the Glimmer feels that or senses that connection to their own enemy. Which might mean that the Glimmer just sees Kynan as a useful tool, and maybe also as somebody who is easier to bridge the gap between realities towards, because he already has that connection to this unreal space, which basically means that we've now got some answers. And that's the, as you may see now if you follow this video, that was the problem I had when trying to do this on the fly, and just every time I would drop an insight, I was like, oh, but what about this thing? But what about that thing? And now I think with putting all the cards on the table and separating them out, we have drilled it out, and we know that from the Ironlanders' perspective, our two themes look very muddled up, but they're actually separate. We know that two factions of true rulers exist. One who is this evil god, cosmic horror faction that wants to come back and overtake the Ironlands, and one that was skeptical of this to begin with, didn't go along with the plan, became the Glimmers, and now opposes them. And we know that the Glimmer Kynan encounters, senses that connection, and wants to make use of Kynan as a tool, because maybe that Glimmer is also aware that the other side has a tool, which is Kaladas, and that Kynan is an opponent of this other tool, and so there is a natural gravitation towards either a use, an abuse, or an alliance. We may figure that out as we go along with the Glimmer here. Which means we know why a Glimmer would want to help Kynan and how it fits into our lore, which is the point of the whole exercise, which means we can continue playing, which means I can record the next session, and which in turn means I'll see you next Tuesday, so huzzah! Thanks for watching, catch you next time, bye for now.